Hey friends, Hannah Nicklin here, Hannah from the future in fact, because this podcast was recorded a few weeks ago, meaning that it predates Die Gute Fabrik's world premiere as part of Day of the Devs at Summer Games Fest, where we announced our brand new story-driven adventure game, Saltsea Chronicles. There you go. That's a fanfare. Please do check it out, either on our socials, where we're Gute Fabrik, which is GUTEFABRIK, or by heading to saltseachronicles.com, or also write to Steam, where wishlisters could help us find more people to tell about the game. So if you've been enjoying these podcasts, it would be an awesome way for you to say thank you. Okay, that's enough from future Hannah. Now I'm going to throw it to past Hannah to kick off the show proper.
The textures of the leaves, the way they look in the fall. You know, they're so bright and green in the spring, and then they sort of deepen to a darker green in the summer, and then in the fall they turn a brilliant orange and yellow, and then they all fall off, and then the vines look dead. It does sort of transport me to home, into my childhood and growing up in a way that makes me feel like I'm sort of like remaking a home space.
Hello and welcome to One Cool Thing, a podcast from indie game studio Die Gute Fabrik, hosted by me, Hannah Nicklin. One Cool Thing is a podcast speaking with people in and around video games about one cool thing not from games, which is really fascinating them right now. We'll introduce them and their practice, talk about the one cool thing they've brought to the conversation, and consider how it's shaping how they think about their work. It's a chance to hear more about the practices of cool folks working in games, and hopefully somewhere where we can all reflect on how we think about how we make. So, without further ado, let's meet our next guest. Okay, so a really warm welcome to California-based Kate Dollarhyde. Kate is a Nebula and GLAAD Media Award-winning game designer and writer of speculative fiction. Actually, I'm going to interrupt my intro already to say, is it GLAAD? Is that how you say it out loud? Or is it GLAAD?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's GLAAD.
GLAAD Media Award-winning game designer and writer of speculative fiction. She's had short stories published in Fireside Fiction, Lackington's, Beneath Ceaseless Skies, amongst a bunch of other super cool magazines, and has also been the co-editor-in-chief of the speculative fiction magazine Strange Horizons. And since about 2018, although in a second, Kate, you'll correct me if it's been earlier than that, Kate has been working in games at Obsidian Entertainment, where she wrote The Outer Worlds, the Pillars of Eternity series, and most recently the smash hit historical story-driven game Pentiment, set in early 16th century Bavaria. Okay, Kate, time for you to add things, amend, expand on that. Was that a reasonable summary, or do you want to add a bunch of other stuff?
No, that's perfect. You've got it exactly right. Since about 2018 to 2017 to 2022, I was working at Obsidian as a narrative designer.
And was that your sort of first sort of big games work, or you'd been doing bits and bobs before then?
That was my first paying games gig. Prior to that, I'd been doing like making fan games in Twine, just trying to figure out how narrative design worked. And then I did some contracting for those fun mobile games that are like short romance stories.
Sure.
But yeah, Obsidian was my first studio job.
So you're hitting that 5-year mark, which a lot of people say is the
Mm-hmm.
the average span in video games. So this is the year we really got to power through and stick at it.
It's very funny you say that, because on what ended up being my 5-year anniversary at Obsidian, I quit the studio. So I've just been contracting since then.
Exciting.
Yeah.
So yeah, finding your way into lots of other things. That's super exciting. We're here to talk about one cool thing that you have brought to offer us. And so this is the point at which I ask you to tell us all what you've brought.
My one cool thing is gardening.
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 Yay. So can you talk to us a bit more about why you chose gardening as your one cool thing?
Sure. So for the past, I want to say about year and a half, my partner and I bought a house, a very tiny house with a very large backyard. And the backyard was completely empty. It was just mulch, essentially. And we had picked the space specifically because the backyard was a blank slate. I'd always really been interested in plants, but gardening in an apartment is very different from gardening outside. And so I really just wanted to try my hand at growing and caring for living things. And so the last year and a half, my personal passion outside of writing has been learning how to garden and learning how to take care of my space and sort of rewild it and fill it with native plants and productive plants. It's been a very exciting, sort of thrilling personal growth project for me.
And so did you grow up around gardens with gardening, like a gardening family, or is this like entirely new to you?
A little bit. So my dad is like cactus crazy. Ever since I was a kid, he's been a cactus collector, cactus and succulents, but mostly cactuses. So we had mostly just like random hedges and green grass lawns when I was a kid, but then we'd have a whole section of our backyard where my dad had his cactus collection in pots.
That was a great time to be a kid. It's just like possibility of not catching the ball and falling over into the cactus planting.
Oh my gosh, the number of times I've had to pull giant cactus vines out of me. Various. Yeah. So he'd always had sort of a passion for taking care of cactuses specifically, and I thought it was very curious and strange. And as I got older, I think that sort of morphed for him into more regular houseplants, establishing a big garden at his own home. He got really into growing grapes. So now I know quite a lot about making wine, even though I have never personally done it. And I think I was always a little bit jealous of his green thumb and his passion for gardening. And I'd sort of taken what I'd learned and wanted to sort of apply it to my own life and my own interests in food gardening, specifically in native plant gardening.
And how did it start? Did you know that this was thing? Was there a big plan, or did you just like kind of go to a garden center? I don't even know if you have garden centers in the US. Presumably you have some kind of mega version of a garden center. Instead of a tiny cafe, there's a mall at the heart of it or something.
Oh, that's so accurate. Yes, usually we'll have like, a big box store like a Home Depot or a Target that has a little garden center attached to it. But we also have independent nurseries. There's a few near me that specialize in native plants or edible plants, but they're, totally independent. Those are my favorite ones. But no, I didn't go in with a huge plan. The emptiness of the backyard was almost overwhelming, honestly. And because I didn't know what I was doing, I didn't want to jump in too deep and then, make myself a big problem and get in over my head. So I started really small, just by making two raised beds out of cedar wood, filling those with dirt, and then putting in a couple things and seeing how they did. We moved into the house in October, so that's sort of the benefit of Southern California, is that we can grow all year. And so I started growing our winter spring crops in that time, and had sort of mixed success. And I learned about fertilizer and other, in retrospect, glaringly obvious things that I didn't really understand. But yeah, I just started really small, but over time I found resources that were specific to my area that helped me have a lot more success, because Southern California there's a lot of microclimates, but it's also just a weird little growing zone in general. So I was able to learn through people who lived near me and expand my operations to something that ended up being a lot more successful and very fun. And now the entire backyard is various little experiments all over the place.
Describe to us what you have now. Where have you sort of progressed to?
Yeah, so we had a little patch of grass that has become 5 raised beds and about, oh gosh, I want to say like 8 or 10. You can buy these old wine barrels at a large garden center that have just been cut in half. And so I drilled a bunch of holes in the bottom and put those all over the place too. So we got a bunch of raised beds. We installed a pergola and then put grapes on that, which was a blast. There's several blueberry plants, golden currants, tons of lavender. And then we added 2 more beds. And now that's full of onions and garlic and a giant, not avocado, artichoke plant that is threatening to take over the whole bed. And then in the very back of the house, there's a small orchard that I've put in. So there's various stone fruits, citrus trees. We have chickens. Things have gotten a little out of control, but in a delightful way.
Lavender, especially, I think, is just an incredible plant to be around. When I lived in London, obviously, I couldn't afford a garden. I wasn't one of those people, but I did. One of the ways that I stayed connected, I was brought up in the countryside, and one of the ways I stayed connected to not city was cycling. And I used to ride out of the city south of London, and in Kent there is, which is a county south of London, they grow lavender commercially. And I would just ride through these like rolling, like some of them fairly tough hills, to be honest. I'd be sweating my way up them, but I'd be surrounded by the scent of lavender, and there was something quite special about that. Do you find yourself sort of finding like sense memories from like certain plants or anything like that?
Yeah, a little bit. It's been really interesting to sort of like working with the grapes, especially. I'm growing table grapes and not wine grapes, but it brings back memories of like helping my dad tend the plants, the textures of the leaves, the way they look in the fall. They're so bright and green in the spring, and then they sort of deepen to a darker green in the summer, and then in the fall they turn a brilliant orange and yellow, and then they all fall off, and then the vines look dead. But it does sort of transport me to home, into my childhood and growing up, and in a way that makes me feel like I'm sort of like remaking a home space here, and just sort of teleporting my little memories to the garden.
I often find myself knowing the names of a plant or sometimes a bird and not knowing where it's come from, except that knowing I must have inherited it from my mother or my grandmother, because
Yeah.
I would be walking around and they would be naming things around me, and I'd never tried to remember those things, but you know, I'll just hear something and know it's a skylark and know that that's just a gift from what I've inherited, you know. But there's also, it sounds really like two things which has come out of this journey for you, this cool thing that's now a part of your life, reconnecting to community and also to the literal like soil of like Southern California, right?
Yeah.
Like you spoke about sort of native plants and like just knowing about the climate and the soil and these things. Like, does that feel like it's an important texture for you about the journey into gardening?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very interesting, at least for me. I was born in Southern California, and then my family moved around quite a lot when I was a kid, and I came back here as high schooler. Went to high school here, went away for college, came back, and now through no really intentions of my own, I'm living in the same county I was born in. And so connecting with the native plants here, I do feel sort of like I'm connecting to my past and my family heritage. My family's been in Southern California for quite a long time at this point. And so getting to know the native plants in my area, or that used to grow in my area, means sort of getting to know California, parts of it as it was before it was sort of suburbanized. So like there's a wonderful application called CalScape, a website that'll allow you to search for native plants in a certain zip code and give you a whole list of different kinds of different plants that are native to your area. And it's been a fascinating way for me to learn about what the ecosystem was like before my house was built on top of it. So through that and research and going to local native plant nurseries, I've been able to find oak trees that are threatened that used to live in this area and no longer do, like Engelmann oaks, and then plant a couple in my front yard, which is very exciting. Getting native salvias and flowers and all of that stuff, helping to bring pollinators to the yard, has also been quite cool. So I've also gotten into, I guess, casual birding just in my backyard. And so, like different hummingbirds will show up in the yard that I'd never seen before. And then being able to look those up and be like, oh, this is a relatively uncommon hummingbird that is here. This is a woodpecker that shows up, like 2 months out of the year. And it's coming to see the native plants in my yard is very cool. And so there's been, I guess for me, a sort of a reconnecting to the place where I come from. And then also through the productive plant gardening, as you said, sort of a connection to community. Part of the reason I wanted to get into growing food, or at least try it out, see if I could be any good at it, was I was just thinking about, like, who knows what the future holds. If I'm ever in a scenario where I need to take care of my family and my community, I want to have useful skills to bring to them, aside from, like, I can write you books and video games. And so being able to feed the people in my life, to feed my neighbors, something that's really important to me. And it's been very cool and very wonderful to connect to my neighbors, people who live next door to me, who live across the street, by bringing them chicken eggs, by bringing them oranges, by bringing them avocados, and then them giving me the stuff that they grow in their yards, guavas and dragon fruit and stuff like that. So it's just been a very fulfilling way to sort of meet the people around me and build strong ties.
For sure, yeah. I'm going to bring a really facile reference to the conversation now, but this is making me think of a scene in the book World War Z. I don't know if you ever read that.
Oh, I did so long ago.
which is actually just a really fun book. It's this sort of report on the zombie apocalypse written after the fact. How did it happen? Reports from different sort of characters in it. And there's a scene where, like, manual laborers are teaching a bunch of, like, ex-Richie Riches about, like, how to garden and how to grow crops. And they're so furious that these people are trying to teach them something, but they don't know how to grow crops. They don't know how to do anything useful.
Yeah.
Their skills are now completely irrelevant. So you can be that person. You can be that useful person. Not that I'm saying there are going to be zombies coming.
Yeah. Well, who knows?
Yes, but I mean, also more seriously, there's a sort of, like, radical personalist political going on here, right? I think I first realized that gardens were an actual sort of political, whether big P or small P political, I'm not sure, thing. When I was, like, 17, I read a play by Tom Stoppard called Arcadia, which in part is about the discovery of mathematics and is in part about the fallibility of historical studies, but is also about gardening. And like the people who decided what gardens were in England in the Enlightenment period, and how they were about angles and beauty and symmetry, versus the romantic gardeners who decided that everything had to look really rugged and there was a hermitage and etc., etc., except it was also still made up, right? And around that time, I sort of learned that all the gardens I saw on American TV were an English idea of what a garden is. Like,
absolutely, yes.
Y'all shouldn't have grass.
No,
like, California should not have lawns, because
no, absolutely not.
It takes so much water to make them grow, and that's it. And you don't live in a watery place.
Absolutely not. It's a desert.
Yeah. So there's something I think also really interesting, like political as a practice of working with native plants and native landscapes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very funny to for you to bring up English gardens, because there is such a received notion of the Platonic ideal of the garden, and the, like, American mind is this traditional English garden, which in many places in the country just don't make sense to grow. There's some locations where the climate is maybe similar, but for most of the country, it just doesn't make sense. So, like, big lawns, big hedges. It's so hard to find native plants unless you're going to a native plant specific nursery, because everything that we sort of get into our big garden centers, there'll be a ton of plants from, like, New Zealand and Australia, from Central and East Asia. And it's like, yeah, they can grow here, over the Mediterranean, especially for Southern California. It's like, yeah, they can grow here, but what about the plants that were already here before we built on top of them? Because the plants from other parts of the world, beautiful as they may be, our local flora and fauna did not, evolve to alongside those plants. So they don't use them as efficiently. It's not what they need to eat, or to live in, or make their nest out of, or what have you. By, putting native plants in the yard, by trying to create or recreate the little ecosystem that used to be here, I feel like it helps, create a home for these creatures that were sort of pushed out of these spaces. But even then, it's like, it's my idea of what a native garden looks like. The vast variety of plants that I can sort of pull in from the various regions around where I live, they wouldn't have grown quite quite the way I would put them together, right? You wouldn't have 30 different kinds of flowers from all the different microclimates in Southern California in one front yard. But I feel like it's still a step in a direction of recreating the space that used to be here.
Another book I read recently, is it called The History of the Dawn of?
Oh, The Dawn of Everything.
Yeah, The Dawn of Everything. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I read that. I've almost finished it. I started reading it and then got really tired. So there you go.
That was my experience of that book. Yeah.
But it's quite overwhelming. But
Mm-hmm.
and the whole point of it is not to offer an exhaustive and pure alternative history. It's saying, look, there are all these records that suggest the way that we've read history has been very much. I don't know, this is kind of funnily connecting to Arcadia, which is also about how all of the sort of fallacies we hold from our context can be transferred to our reading of history to just read something completely wrong, basically. And they land on the Americas. I mean, the bit that is now Canada more than I think the bit which is now the USA, but they cover like a whole rich kind of thing of history, and a lot of it is saying that actually farming isn't the way that everyone went. It isn't the way that all societies were built, and certainly that might have been true of parts of Europe, but a lot of communities survived and thrived and developed themselves on different agrarian techniques, which might have been moving around a bunch and settling in different places at different times of year along a river, rather than cultivating one place and that kind of thing. So I'm sure that we should educate ourselves on on this more. Thank you so much for sharing with us more about your sort of fascination with gardening at the moment, or hopefully continuing. Obviously, I don't want to imply that it's a thing that you're going through. There's a thing that you're in. From that context, can you share any examples of how gardening is shaping your practice as someone involved in games?
Oh my gosh. Yes, I want to say that I feel like the most valuable lesson there, I suppose there's two. The most valuable lessons I've learned from gardening are probably faith and resilience. The thing about a garden is that it takes so long to develop, right? You start it in one season, you don't see the fruits of that for another season. You don't really see the garden, the things that you planned or planted come into their own for almost 2 years. You plant a fruit tree and you cannot expect to get fruit for at least a couple of years, as it sort of gets situated in your space. And so you have to have faith when you are setting this stuff out, that you are making good choices for the moment that will bear fruit in the future. And that is so much making games, right? You don't know how the game is going to come together at the end. Very likely you will make a lot of different choices and remake them across the period of production. But you have to have faith that you and the people you're working with are, and all the little choices that you're making are coming together to create something, vibrant and whole and beautiful. And so holding on to that, faith in the process, but also faith in the vision of what you're trying to make, has certainly been a very valuable lesson that I've learned. And then also just resilience. I have a very aggressive artichoke plant that I've tried to kill several times and it keeps coming back. I eventually just put a garden bed on top of it, layers of cardboard, layers of dirt, planted onions in it. And then a few months later, it was like, hey, I'm back. It was popping right out through the bed again. And I was like, okay, I can't kill the artichoke. It wants to be here. I guess it's just going to live here. And then on the flip side, plants I pay very close attention to and I'm doing my best to take care of die from overattention. So I think there's something there about being resilient against the things that try to take you down. Games can be a very challenging space to work in sometimes. There are always setbacks. The lows can be quite low, but you can keep growing through it sometimes. And then hypervigilance around, paying too close attention to things can also, hurt them. And so sometimes backing off and letting things develop as they develop and not trying to exert total control over the things around you is actually better for the health of the garden or the game or the team that you're working on.
Be the artichoke.
Yeah. Be the artichoke in your life.
I wonder if you have any cool specific stories about, so obviously Pentiment is everyone's mind right now, winning a bunch of awards and nominations. You're a BAFTA nominee. That's super exciting.
Yeah.
So I wonder if there are any moments where, I don't know, gardening helped you work through something in your head with Pentiment, or whether lessons you've learned from gardening sort of strengthened your resolve in a moment in the development of Pentiment.
It's very interesting. I feel like my development with gardening happened in parallel with the development of Pentiment. And I think what I most took away from it, or helped me most with developing Pentiment, was understanding the way the people in the town of Tassing in 16th century Bavaria, how closely they lived with the land. They were entirely subject to the weather. They were entirely subject to the land and the conditions. And they were also subject to, the lords and the church. But that, because I ended up writing most of the peasants in Pentiment, that gave me I think a very helpful sort of understanding of the context they were operating in, and helped me sort of, I guess, build empathy with them to understand, a bridge to understanding what their life might have been like. There's so many failures and setbacks in gardening, and for me, it became like a place of refuge when there would be failures and setbacks in the game. If a specific design doesn't work out, or it's getting, playtest feedback that is like contradicting, or we're not sure how to solve the problem. Because I worked at home, for me, it was very helpful to just go out into the garden and spend time with the plants and taking my mind off obsessing over whatever the design problem was, and then letting my sort of subconscious cook on it while I was just digging around in the dirt. I feel like I ended up solving a lot of character problems that way, or design problems.
I think I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think that I'm keen for One Cool Thing not to be about saying everything that you do in your life is about making games. It's more to do with like, you're a whole human who makes games. And of course, everything in your life shapes you, and then you choose to shape games with some of your time. But escape is as important as like how things contribute to your practice, right? And part of practice is rest. Part of practice is laying fallow, if we're going to use earthy terms, right? It's allowing the soil to recharge. So I think that it's really important to bring up that escape is a really important practice. And like for me, I'm struggling a little bit sort of post like COVID era exhaustion, I have to say, with my relationship to cycling. And it has always, in times before, been a place of refuge and escape, and a place where ideas kind of would percolate in my mind, but it was like they were happening in my peripheral vision, but I was just looking forward and pedaling, right? And I've struggled so much losing that, because I just don't have the energy to get out most days, and I also then don't have the energy to recharge because I'm not doing that thing. So I think that it's a real treasure, and if you find the place where you recharge, like, treasure it. Tend to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad you highlighted that, because when I ended up leaving Obsidian in May of 2022, I left because I was really tremendously burned out, and I couldn't summon the enthusiasm and the energy I needed to do good work that I was really proud of, and to lead my teams well. And so I did have to have this long fallow period of basically May to August, where I couldn't do anything writing or games adjacent at all. I got back into photography. I spent almost all of my time in the garden, and that was really regenerative for me. And I came back to my games writing practice and my personal writing practice really renewed, even though I hadn't gone out and had a bunch of new and very exciting life experiences. It was just not exercising those muscles for a while let me come back to them stronger and more fortified to reapply them.
I think another really interesting thing about Pentiment is that it is a story that you tend to over time also, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a story that you plant the seeds of, and then tiny spoiler, there are substantial time skips in Pentiment, right? Where the choices you make begin to flourish, and in any case, you see how things sort of grow and change and reshape in this like really consequential time in sort of 16th century kind of European politics. I guess, is there a favorite seed that you could talk to us about without spoiling too much that gets planted early on, and that it's just, it doesn't have to be a significant one, just your favorite kind of like thing that flourishes over that time period?
Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah, one of the great joys of Pentiment is that it takes place over the course of 25 years, and or maybe a little bit longer than that. But one of it's so funny how games work. One of my favorite things that I ended up putting in Pentiment in the first act is you meet a character called Paul. I think he's about 8 years old when you meet him. He's the son of the miller. His dad is very overbearing and honestly quite cruel. And Paul is this like very sweet, gentle boy who is really interested in art, but his father, wants him to be a miller, doesn't think there's really anything worthwhile in art. And so when he meets Andreas, the player character, who is a professional artist, this is the first time Paul's ever met somebody who is interested in the same things that he's interested in and can tell him like how to get from A to B in that career. Paul ultimately does not become an artist. He is a miller, but over the course of the acts, as you get to know Paul, if you have encouraged him to pursue art, he does, and he gets better. And then he has a son who is also into art, and he allows his son to draw freely, essentially, and he draws on the mill, on the ruins, but that small player impact very early in the story sort of changes over the course of the entire game. And one of the things I really loved about that was that I added that detail about Paul kind of on a whim, and then I left the development of Pentiment for about 6 months to work on a different game at the studio. And then I came back to help close it out and then get it out the door. And I got to come back and see how the rest of the team had developed that into something, that was so much bigger and so much more meaningful than I had initially sort of dashed off as a fun little detail. And so it had grown while I was not looking at it.
Yeah, and that connects us to community again, right? Like,
it does, yeah.
One of the sparkling delights of like making video games really, really tiring. I probably shouldn't talk too much because I'm in a launch year right now, so like I'm extra tired. But one of the delights really is planting those seeds and handing them to someone else, and then looking away for a little while and turning back and seeing that they brought to life in a way that you never could have on your own, something that you sort of you take to them. So that's super nice. Thank you.
Real quick, I just want to say, I don't know if anyone has mentioned this to you specifically, but one of the earliest seeds of Pentiment's design was Mutazione. We all played it as a team. It was, I think, of the games that we sort of reviewed as comps for this game when we were initially designing it, I think it was one that everyone on the team really, really enjoyed. And we drew so much of that forward in as seeds into Pentiment. So Pentiment kind of grew out of Mutazione.
Well, that has made my day. Thank you. Thank you so much. And
thank you for making that game.
I mean, it was a game that really did need a lot of bedding in as well. Like it grew in Nils's mind before he even founded the company, over a decade before it came out. And we're sharing a bunch of stuff on Instagram right now, including like character sheets that Nils drew a decade before it came out, and some of these characters are like almost fully formed in his mind. And it was a real generosity with which Nils like offered me, because I sort of joined and they were kind of, he had this story world and characters, but they didn't have anyone helping them tell it. They hadn't thought about the narrative design or the quality of the writing and how to bring it to life in those terms. and it was such generosity with which Nils offered me that world and let me sort of shape and reshape it with him. And it's also lots of gardening in Metazione as well. So that's a lovely circle back there. I'm going to wrap us up. Is there a final thought or lesson that you might like to offer the lovely listeners with regards to your one cool thing?
Take time to rest pursuing creative or regenerative work that does not better capitalism.
I agree.
Heal yourself through that. Yeah.
And I guess we should say that there's a bunch of privilege involved in being able to rest. Like if people are carers or people are, doing 9 to 5 jobs, just sort of, and struggling to put food on the table, being told to rest is a super like tough thing to find. I think my answers there are always like, rest on your boss's dollar.
Yeah.
Like if you do what David Graeber called in one of his books a bullshit job, which is a job where someone wouldn't notice if you didn't work for an hour, find that space if you can. And there's a really, really beautiful book actually, which is particularly aimed at I guess how patriarchy plays into burnout. The book is called Burnout, and it's this super accessible book by two people called Nagowski. I think one of them is called Emily, and one of them is called Amelia. Emily and Amelia Nagowski. And this book, Burnout: The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle, it's the book that in my life has most equipped me to understand better that stress is a physiological experience and stresses are external causes of stress. But even if you can't address those stresses, you can resolve stress, this physiological cycle in your body. And that doesn't have to be through, like, one of the ways is exercise, but you could dance or you could cry or you could, it gives you all of these techniques. And it's also trans inclusive. It's also acknowledges the role white supremacy plays in stress. It is, it's got a very pink cover. It does look like a self-help book, but I think that they did that to like stealth it into people's lives because it's a really beautiful read on resolving the stress response cycle in our bodies. And rest can take many forms. And part of it is also about addressing the fact that if you are socialized to take more caring responsibilities than others, for example, if you were, raised as a woman under patriarchy, for example, you are less likely to believe that you are deserving of rest, and that might be a thing that people could find space to be fallow through aggressively demanding to themselves even that they're worth it and they deserve it. It's a thing I feel really strongly about. As ever, all of the things that we've mentioned here will go into the liner notes. So if we've referenced something, it'll be there for you all to discover and uncover. In the meantime, do you have anything that you'd like to promote and any socials that we should follow you on?
Sure. Let's see. I am present on Twitter and Instagram as Kate Dollarhyde, all one word. Keep it easy. And at the moment, I think the only thing I want to promote is Pentiment. If a narrative adventure murder mystery set in 16th century Bavaria sounds appealing to you, I would encourage you to give it a shot. It's about 20 hours. It's on Xbox and PC, free through Game Pass. If you have Game Pass, which is not free, please give it a shot. It's a true labor of love from the team. It was a real pleasure to work on.
And I would even encourage you, if you're not sure if that's what you want, to give it a go because it's really surprising and beautiful. And I think it's a real gem. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
hope you'll win the BAFTA. I haven't had a look at the shortlist actually, so maybe there's lots of people I want to win and everyone should get one. That's also a possibility. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, Kate Dollarhyde, and yeah, hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Hannah. You too. Take care.
I loved listening to Kate talk about her connection to gardening. And while this conversation focused on the personal, just towards the end here, I thought it was worth noting that there are obviously political connections at work too. We touched on the climate crisis and how it's affecting planting and growing in Kate's garden, but obviously at a greater scale, crops and food security are massively under threat as climate crisis worsens. If you're looking for more listening on what it looks like to do something about that on a just green transition, I really recommend the Planet B podcast, which brings together different speakers, activists, and Indigenous folks on themes like debt, work, climate reparations, borders, water, land, infrastructure, and more. Go to global-gnd.com to get a hold of the podcast and also a free-to-download book. There'll be a link in the liner notes. And then last but definitely not least, Kate and I were talking about a kind of gardening derived from an English or Western tradition, but before the Americas were colonized by Europeans, there would have been a much wider variety of cultivation techniques specific to each local culture and community. Just as one example, we've linked in the liner notes to an article called The Three Sisters of Indigenous American Agriculture, which is a really excellent USDA National Agricultural Library article on intercropping employed by the Seneca, an Iroquoian tribe inhabiting western New York State. The three sisters in question are corn, beans, and squash, and the article offers super interesting insight onto not just how it works scientifically, but also how it's culturally and significant spiritually to the tribe in question. It wasn't really a topic appropriate for Kate and me to cover, but I didn't want to wrap up a discussion of American land without noting that the land is colonized and that the colonization of growing practices is a part of that. With that, I am going to wrap up now. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of One Cool Thing from Die Gute Fabrik. As usual, leave a rating or review where you can. If this time was of value to you, then that's a really good way to say thank you. We're also super delighted to say that Die Gute Fabrik's next major game project is now announced. Yes, it may have been secret when this podcast is recorded, but it's now public and we are super excited. Saltsea Chronicles is a flooded world, brand new story-driven adventure game where you investigate a mystery as a ship's whole crew. It represents a real step up in storytelling ambition from our last title, Mutazione, but it's still beautifully designed and animated and with what I honestly believe is some world-class storytelling. So wishlist Saltsea Chronicles on Steam right now and head to saltseachronicles.com to find out more. I'll be back soon with a new episode speaking with another cool thinker and maker in the field of video games. And in the meantime, check out Die Gute Fabrik on Instagram, Twitter and YouTube, where you can find us as GUTEFABRIK, Gute Fabrik. This podcast was produced, edited and sound designed by Tom Wally. Additional production and research by Unaming Kavanagh. And our theme music is by Nick Ellis, whose music you can find under the name Tenby on Bandcamp, TENBY. Stay thoughtful, friends. Take care. Goodbye.